Hello everyone. Okay, so this is Marta. Marta runs a food and drink store in Accra in Ghana. And among the commodities she sells is some local brand Ghanaian beer made in a factory nearby. And we'll come back to the beer in a second. I don't know very much about Marta, but there are aspects of her life one could plausibly guess at. Maybe she's a mother. Maybe family members help her produce the food she sells. If so, then she'd be quite typical of the sort of figure who might be brought into focus in order to problematise classical Marxian categories. She's the owner of a micro-business in the global south. It's hard to conceive of her as a capitalist, but she isn't exactly just a worker either. And how should we analyse the role in the circuits of capital played by her socially reproductive labour at home, which might feed back into the production processes she presides over at her stall by dint of the labour of family members? As these questions proliferate, she might become emblematic of the porousness at the margins of capitalist production that, among other things, social reproduction theory helps us to identify. But it's not for the purposes of elaborating on those kinds of questions that I'm introducing you to Marta. Let's zoom out to the scene where I met her. I met her on the pages of an NGO report into corporate tax avoidance in Ghana, specifically an Action Aid report on the tax practices of UK-listed brewing multinational SAB Miller. SAB Miller owns the brewery near Marta's food and drink stall and makes the local brand lager she sells. Now, Marta has to pay tax because she's a business owner running a market stall, whereas the SAB Miller subsidiary that brews and bottles the beer she sells paid no tax whatsoever. Marta was brought into the Action Aid report to add a personal touch. It notes how surprised she was to learn that with her market stall, her humble market stall, she has to pay tax, whereas the factory nearby with its extensive production facilities and executives in smart cars and suits paid no tax. So, why is it that SAB Miller's Ghanaian subsidiary paid no tax? Action Aid included in their report this helpful diagram which gives you an overview. Essentially, it's tax-deductible payments to other SAB Miller subsidiaries in tax havens. Interest payments, management service charges. Perhaps the most objectionable is the royalty for the use of the beer brand. The beer brand was developed locally in Ghana and when the company was independent and locally managed. When SAB Miller bought the company, they moved the intellectual property out of Ghana, and now the company makes tax-deductible payments to a sister company in the Netherlands to use it. And what we're looking at here is an example of what's called a global wealth chain. You've probably heard of global value chains, and global value chains are a related phenomenon which we'll look at shortly. What a global wealth chain is a mechanism whereby accumulation is engineered so as to take place outside the scope of the power of the state to tax it. Wealth chains come in a wide range of varieties. Some of them are obviously illegal, money laundering for example, and some of them take place within the confines of carefully structured legal transactions, like SAB Miller's tax avoidance. The specific strategy in this case is the abuse of intra-group transactions, priced so as to cause profitability to accumulate in tax havens. You've probably heard of transfer pricing. Well, this is an example of the kind of adverse impacts it can have. Wealth chains almost always involve tax havens, or secrecy jurisdictions as they're commonly called. And the amount of wealth held in secrecy jurisdictions is absolutely vast. So here's somebody estimating that it's 10% of global GDP. I mean, we don't know because that's why it's held in secrecy jurisdictions. Now, a key point here is that the phenomenon of global wealth chains, tax avoidance, is a feminist issue and something to which we should pay attention from a social reproduction perspective. And at this point, it may be worth having a little micro detour around the subject of feminist theories of the state. So from a liberal or social democratic perspective, the capitalist welfare state is viewed as a good thing for those who are disproportionately burdened by unpaid socially reproductive labour. For one thing, the state employs people to perform socially reproductive labour which would otherwise be unpaid. Secondly, the state makes cash transfers through the benefit system to those performing socially reproductive labour. And thirdly, the state provides various forms of infrastructure and material resources assisting in socially reproductive labour, ranging from reproductive healthcare to subsidised public transport. Now, Marxist feminists have traditionally warned against this siren song since the capitalist welfare state is still, capitalist, and is always going to be a vector of structural gender and class oppression. But since the global financial crisis, there's been a kind of convergence of these positions, because however bad the capitalist welfare state may be, it's still worse if women are losing their jobs, losing their welfare payments, and losing their infrastructure. In the UK, for example, the impact of austerity in pure cash terms, i.e. just in terms of the tax and benefit system, leaving aside all other impacts, was calculated in 2015 as imposing 83% of its adverse impact on women. In the global south, of course, the salient question is not so much to do with what is lost, as to do with what people still don't have. In Ghana, for example, where Martha lives and works, and where S.A.B. Miller avoided all that tax, the maternal mortality rate is 35 times as high as it is in the UK. ActionAid's S.A.B. Miller report came out in 2010, and it formed part of an increasingly vocal civil society campaign to get something done about corporate tax avoidance. And this campaign started to get taken increasingly seriously by politicians and technocrats. By the end of 2013, the OECD, which is in effect an international standard-setting body for corporate tax regimes, had been mandated by the G20 Rich Countries Club to come up with improved global corporate tax norms to stamp out tax avoidance. And what's interesting for us in this conversation today is how that goal was articulated. As things stood, huge amounts of profitability were being allocated to tax havens and therefore going untaxed, and profits should instead, said the OECD and the G20, be allocated for tax purposes to where value is created. So it's worth pausing to understand what's going on here. A giant amount of profitability is being allowed to accumulate offshore. A group of the 20 richest and most powerful countries on the planet decided it was going to be reallocated to other jurisdictions, so as to put greater spending power in the hands of states. And as we've seen, spending power in the hands of states tends to relieve the burden of unpaid social reproduction. But the reallocation was going to take place in accordance with some kind of conception of where value is created. So the answer to the question of who gets the money is going to depend on how we theorise value. And that makes the distributional impact of how we theorise value potentially very important indeed from the point of view of social reproduction. Is the money going to continue to slosh between rich countries and tax havens, or is some of it going to be reallocated to where it's most desperately needed, i.e. in the global south? So the next step is to think about what we mean by value. And the first thing we can do under this head is to rule out the marginalist value theory of modern mainstream economics. Modern mainstream economics doesn't really have a theory of value, it has a theory of price formation in markets. Now, the international tax rules that so badly needed changing in 2013 are founded on the principle that intra-group transactions must be aligned with market prices. So to base the solution on the theory of price formation is begging the question. But that didn't stop the OECD from trying, and what they came up with was described by tax scholar Ita Greenberg as the bourgeois labour theory of value. And to understand the bourgeois labour theory of value, it's necessary to think a bit about global value chains, which I mentioned earlier. So, in brief, global value chains are the disaggregation of production processes across borders, and as everybody knows, this disaggregation has the consequence that multinational companies could dominate the global production network, extracting super profits by suppressing the profitability of other participants in the chain. And here's a famous curve illustrating how that plays out. It's called the smile curve. So what we have here along the x-axis is production processes, and what we have up the y-axis is the apparent profitability of those processes when disaggregated from other processes. And what we see is that the least profitable element is actual material production. All the money is in stuff like design and branding and the rest of it. So far, so well known, but it's quite startling to see it laid out like that the processes that create the commodities that meet our material needs are the ones that are the least profitable to perform. Anyway, what the OECD sought to achieve in its first round of reforms was allocating profitability away from tax havens and towards the places where these so-called value-adding processes take place. The way they did this was by bolstering the role that labour plays in the allocation, as contrasted with the formal ownership of various legal rights like intellectual property or debt, which can easily be shifted to tax havens. And that's why Greenberg referred to it as the bourgeois labour theory of value, because this was a matter of reallocating profitability towards where labour of the kind associated with capitalist profitability takes place. And that excludes the kind of classically proletarian labour associated with the production of material commodities. This, of course, has not just class implications, but implications to do with global distribution, because it also excludes the kind of labour which predominates in the global south. So to put this in terms of Martha's experience, this will reallocate the profitability of multinationals away from the tax havens where it's accumulating, but it's more likely to result in bolstering fiscal resources in the UK than bolstering fiscal resources in Ghana. But it gets worse. Even if we accept that all these other forms of labour are the ones creating the value that we see represented in corporate profitability, it still isn't enough to account for the sheer profitability of some of the lead firms in the global production network. There continues to be a huge wodge of profits, of offshore profitability, like Google, Facebook and Amazon. This is thought of as a problem to do with the so-called digital economy. And almost universally in tax technocratic circles, the place where it's thought that this profitability should be allocated for tax purposes is the market jurisdictions where users and buyers are located. So what we're really talking about is a sort of composite bourgeois labour and consumption theory of value. The proposition here is that if you buy stuff on Amazon, or you buy some stuff because it was advertised to you on Facebook, it's your interaction with these websites' algorithms that has created the value that's reflected in those companies' profits, rather than, you know, the labour of the people who made the stuff. But it's proposed that your public exchequer, rather than the public exchequers of the states where the stuff is actually made, gets a tax boost as a result. Which means that to the extent that the burden of social reproduction is relieved by state expenditure, that relief is going to continue to be provided in rich countries at the expense of the global south. So the OECD's homespun theories of value to fill up the value created by marginalism are really just ideology intended to keep money circulating around rich countries. So much then for the mainstream. What about the classical tradition of Adam Smith, David Ricardo and Karl Marx? Well, they find the value creation takes place here, within what is sometimes pejoratively referred to as the production boundary. The processes of production of material commodities such as mining, fishing, agriculture, manufacture, transportation. And so, in the unlikely event that the OECD were to pick up some proper value theory from books, rather than just making it up as they went along, it would lead to some very different distributional consequences. Specifically, the entirety of that huge offshore wad of cash would find itself being taxed in the places where large numbers of people, many of them women of course, do low-paid work producing the material commodities that fulfill the material needs of everyone else. And it's no coincidence that those are the places where tax revenues are most desperately needed in order to relieve the burden of unpaid socially reproductive labour in the various ways I mentioned earlier. So what is this production boundary? How is it derived? What lies inside it? What lies outside it? Well, its origin lies in one of the questions that classical political economy seeks to answer, which presents itself as a paradox. If the things we buy and sell are equal in value to the amounts of money exchanged for them, where does profit come from? Capitalists buy labour and means of production, and yet their output is worth more than the costs of the labour and the means of production combined. Where does that extra value come from? Marx's theory of value constitutes an answer to this question. So the answer is that you get more out of labour than you put in, by which I mean that labour costs less in terms of the labour embodied in the commodities purchased out of a worker's wages than you get out of the worker in terms of the labour going into the commodities that you produce. So there's less labour embodied in there than embodied in there. And that's where that comes from, right? Now there's a real risk of misunderstanding here. Labour has a cost which is represented here by these wage goods. Now you might reasonably ask, what about social reproduction? Where does that fit in? And the answer is that we could indeed recognise it in the equation, but it would make no difference to the equation as an equation, because like the basket of wage goods, it would go in on both sides. The question addressed by this equation is not why are capital's costs lower than they might otherwise be, and that is a question to which unpaid social reproduction is part of the answer, but however high or low capital's costs, how come the output is even theoretically capable of being greater rather than equal to those costs? And that's why social reproduction doesn't figure in Marx's discussion of value. It's not because he was a massive sexist, although undoubtedly he was, but it's because his discussion of this question in particular is not where to look for stuff that figures on both sides of the equation. But that point is by the by. The reason we're going into value theory is to find out where the production boundary comes from. And the answer to that question lies right at the heart of Marx's contribution to value theory. So if you look at this equation, there's something that very clearly remains to be explained about it, which is how two completely different aggregations of commodities, made in a variety of different ways, can contain determinate quantities of labour of a quantifiably comparable sort, such that one aggregation can meaningfully be said to contain more labour than another. Marx explained this using the concept of abstract labour, which needs to be explained quite carefully in order to be understood. How much time have I got left?
For abstract labour?
All right, I'm just going to go for it. I was considering skipping the slide. Abstract labour is the substance of value, in the sense that different amounts of value are different amounts of abstract labour. And the crucial thing to understand about abstract labour is that it comes into being by virtue of exchange. Here are two different commodities made by different kinds of concrete labour. Labour A, B and C make the green boxes, labour D and E make red boxes. These different kinds of concrete labour are, as I say, all different from each other, but if two red boxes exchange for the same amount of money, as one green box, that necessarily brings them into quantitative equivalence, even though they are qualitatively different. Yeah, so A plus B plus C is 2x plus 2y. So they're quantitatively equivalent. Exchange makes them quantitatively equivalent, even though they're qualitatively different. Got some sort of confused looking faces. Do we follow this?
Yeah.
Right. Good. Right. So abstract labour is that quantitative equivalence conceived of as a general property of commodities as at the point of exchange. But the crucial point for present purposes is that this only works. This formula at the bottom of the slide showing the quantitative equivalence of different categories of concrete labour, for labour which is quantitatively implicated in the quantities of commodities exchanging. And not all labour is like that. Take, for example, the labour that goes into writing a book as contrasted with the labour that goes into printing a book. So if you have 2,000 copies of a book exchanging instead of 1,000, that implicates greater quantities of past printing labour, but it doesn't implicate any greater quantity of past authorship. And that's where the production boundary comes from. It doesn't mean that the work of writing the book isn't useful or important or necessary. It just means that the number of a given commodity available for exchange at a particular moment in time is not quantitatively dependent on the prior allocation of resources to that category of labour. So, value is created by the kinds of labour where the quantities of commodity exchanging reflect a prior quantitative commitment of that labour. And, as I explained earlier, operating the conventional classical production boundary arising from this understanding of value would tend to militate in favour of reallocating currently untaxed profitability to the global south, with a consequent distributional benefit for those disproportionately burdened and placed at risk by socially reproductive labour. So not only is it analytically sound to operate this production boundary, it's also politically useful from a feminist perspective. It's important to emphasise that this boundary does not delineate some kind of idealised category. When we say that labour within it creates value, we're not making judgments about what is necessary or important. Value isn't a good thing. Value, in its drive to valorise itself, is the monster that needs defeating. Being clear-eyed about what is creating it is going to help us abolish it. There was a time when Marxist feminists sought to challenge the production boundary. You've heard about that already. But social reproduction theorists today no longer tend to... So as we've heard, that challenge was based on the proposition that unpaid socially reproductive labour creates value. Social reproduction theorists today no longer tend to argue that unpaid domestic labour is productive of value, but it's a question around which a strategic silence is maintained, as if there's still something politically unpalatable about the conclusion that unpaid domestic labour does not, after all, produce value. So Titi Bhattacharya, editor of this book, will tell you, if asked, that unpaid domestic labour does not produce value, but you'll look in vain between these covers for a written claim to that effect. It seems to be a topic where the less said, the better. But from my perspective as an activist working towards feminist goals in global fiscal justice, this attitude mistakes the danger. I don't believe there is a risk that if we acknowledge that unpaid socially reproductive labour is not value producing, that people will suddenly forget that it's a sphere in which exploitation and structural oppression takes place. It doesn't seem to me that value theory has that kind of political purchase in the left activist mindset these days. Maybe in the past, but not today. There may have been a time when the enemy of the Marxist feminist was a Marxist economist or trade unionist or Trotskyite activist who thinks that the only labour that matters is value-producing labour. But I just don't think anyone pays much attention to those kinds of people these days. There is a real political danger, by contrast, in treating the production boundary as if it's obsolete. The danger is of people in rich countries believing that we are the creators of the value reflected in the material conditions of our existence, rather than low-paid people in under-resourced tax states at the other end of global chains of value and wealth. While it seems intuitively attractive from a feminist perspective to suppose that unpaid domestic labour produces value, it's hard to spot a clear analytical boundary. It's hard to spot a clear analytical boundary between unpaid domestic labour and, for example, the social media usage which the OECD is suggesting justifies recycling all that untaxed wealth through the public purses of rich countries. After all, we've all used social media to provide care of some sort to friends and family members. Indeed, I believe we should now positively embrace the fact that unpaid domestic labour falls outside the production boundary and look at how much corporate sector labour also falls outside the production boundary. What this suggests is that global capitalism has a vast capacity to fund unproductive labour, which means that it has an equally vast capacity to fund social reproduction through the state, potentially relieving the burden and risks of unpaid and under-resourced socially reproductive labour worldwide. In policy terms, what I'm talking about is effective progressive taxation targeting corporate profits globally, gender budgeting and state expenditure, and crucially, the reallocation of fiscal resources to the global south. And then the question is how to take that programme and convert it into a programme to abolish value altogether, everywhere.